Which players down in Atlantis represent the biggest matchup issues for Gonzaga, and could it trip them up before a title bout with Arizona?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, place your first $5 bet, and you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win. Just visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Well, it is a mailbag edition of the Locked On Zags podcast. For those of you who are newer listeners to the show, we usually do mailbags every Monday, but when we get into the season and the Zags are frequently playing on weekends, we tend to scrap the mailbags in favor of recaps from those games. But this was a situation where we could do a full mailbag episode. If you want to get involved in Mailbag Monday, the easiest way to do so is to join the Locked On Zags Discord channel. There is a link in the show notes, whether you're on an audio platform or on YouTube. Click the link. It's free to join. There's 350 plus Gonzaga fans in there. We're talking all the time. We're talking about the WCC, the Pac-12, the Zags, the women's team, the baseball team, general college basketball, all sorts of stuff. There's a spot in there to submit your mailbag questions as well. If you don't want to join Discord, you can also follow me on Twitter or Blue Sky or Instagram, all Locked On Zags or Andy Patton CBB for my personal accounts. You can also email me, andypatton013@gmail.com if you want to get your questions answered that way. All right, let's get straight into it. This first question comes from Spring2502 on Discord, who says, which team and or player will present the biggest challenge next week? Yeah, the best team is still Arizona. Arizona, they lost to Wisconsin 2 weeks ago or so, went out to Madison, gave up 103 points to the Badgers. It was a foul fest. For those of you who didn't see this game, John Tanji, the starting guard for Wisconsin, scored 41 points. 21 of them came at the free throw line. It was an absurd basketball game, but it kind of highlighted some of Arizona's issues, mostly on the defensive end of the floor. Arizona also lost to Duke. That was a home loss, which is never good, but at least Duke is a better team than Wisconsin, although Wisconsin is now a top 25 team and will probably stay there until they start losing some games. So it's neither are terrible losses, but obviously losing at home is never good. Duke beat them by about 14. The issue in that one was less defensive, but more offensive. So there's some strife, some concern a little bit about Arizona right now with 2 losses early in the season, not looking particularly good offensively against Duke, who is very good defensively, mind you, and not looking great defensively against Wisconsin, but they're still the best team in this field. The biggest thing that I think could trip Gonzaga up before that game is Indiana, and is more specifically Mackenzie Mbako. I think Mackenzie Mbako might be the biggest matchup issue Gonzaga could conceivably run into in this tournament. Mackenzie Mbako, for those of you who do not know, he's a sophomore forward for Indiana. He's a freshman last year. He's a top 10 rated freshman in that class. He was initially committed to Duke. He decommitted from Duke, went to Indiana, and was fine last year for the Hoosiers. He wasn't great. He wasn't terrible. He was just inconsistent. The three-point shot, which is kind of a big calling card for him, just wasn't really there. But he's a 6'8", 6'9", long, rangy, NBA-built wing who can put the ball on the deck, who can shoot it, who can rebound well. He's got a lot of things going for him. And this year, he has been fantastic. He wasn't great in Indiana's most recent game, but he's played very well outside of that. This season, he's shooting exceptionally well from three. And I don't know who the heck is going to guard him for Gonzaga. That is my biggest concern for that Indiana game, because he plays the three. They play Umar Ballo at the 5. We're all familiar with Umar Ballo, of course. They play Malik Reneau at the 4, and then they play Mbako at the 3 at 6'8", 6'9". So for Gonzaga, based on their current starting lineup, that would be Khalif Battle's responsibility. You could slide Michael Ajayi onto him, but then you have Battle guarding Malik Reneau, who's averaging like 17 points a game as a really good low-post scorer. Obviously, you could put Ike on Reneau, but then you have Battle guarding Umar Ballo, and let's be honest, that's not going to work either. There's going to be a matchup issue for Gonzaga defensively against Indiana. There is no other way to look at it that is going to be a problem. Gonzaga could opt to play a lineup that they have not played yet this season. The great Stephen Carr posted this on social media that Ben Gregg and Mike Ajayi have played 0 minutes together this year, which is a very unique statistic that might have to change if Gonzaga plays Indiana, because they might need either Ben or more likely Michael Ajayi to guard Mbako away from the rim, to have Ben be guarding Malik Renaud down low, and then to have either EK or Huff on Ballo. That they might have to change the lineup and do that, because otherwise I think they're going to have some issues. And Ballo represents a challenge himself. Obviously a player who's familiar with Gonzaga, who's huge, who's a really good shot blocker. He's going to give Graham EK trouble on that end of the floor and could potentially get Graham in foul trouble on the other end. So Gonzaga's a better team than Indiana. Indiana's not a great three-point shooting team. Their guards haven't played all that well yet this year, but they represent some serious matchup issues that, if utilized correctly, could trip up the Zags before they get to that game against Arizona in the championship. Next question here comes from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, agree or disagree, by the time Feast Week events are over, Gonzaga will be 4-0 against teams from the Big 12 during the 24-25 season? Yeah, I'm going to say agree. Gonzaga's playing West Virginia on Wednesday morning, 11:30 a.m. Pacific time. It'll be the second game of the battle for Atlantis behind Indiana Louisville, which will be that first game at 9 a.m. And I think Gonzaga beats West Virginia. I am not super concerned about West Virginia. We'll talk more about them, obviously, before we get into that game. But West Virginia is a team with a new coach, Darian DeVries. They have some talent, including Coach DeVries' son, Tucker DeVries, who averaged 21 points per game last year at Drake, a very good mid-major program, followed his dad to West Virginia. They also have other really talented guards on that team, and I think they're going to be decent this year, but they're not as good as Gonzaga. And I don't think they match up all that well with Gonzaga. I think Gonzaga handles that one fairly easily. Then they got to get by either Indiana or Louisville, which we just talked about. Meanwhile, on the other side of the bracket, Arizona has a fairly cushy path to get to that championship game. They will take on Davidson in the first game. They should win that one. Davidson's not very good right now. Then they take on either Providence or Oklahoma. Both teams are undefeated. Neither team scares me much at all. I think Arizona rolls in that one as well. And then Gonzaga, I think, is going to take down Arizona. Obviously, some of the matchup stuff there, Tommy Lloyd knows Mark Few better than anybody in the entire country. So I think that does create a tougher dichotomy. Of course, it's flipped the other way as well, as Mark Few knows Tommy extremely well. But I think Gonzaga is the better team. I think talent wins out, and I think they ultimately win this one and end up 4-0 against the Big 12 before the calendar even flips to December. Final question of the first segment here comes from Jim on Facebook. Jim says, with the rotation shaping up, where would you see Steele fitting in if he were healthy? Yeah, this is a really good question, and I'm sad that we don't know the answer, obviously, because I am sad for Steele Venters, who we really have wanted to see for 2 years now. It's really tragic that he was unable to get on the floor last year, which when Gonzaga really needed him and did not have the depth to stomach his absence, and it showed throughout the season. And then this year, obviously, you still would have loved to see him on the floor, although Gonzaga very clearly had a better plan in place for this. I don't know if that was why they added players like Innocente or some others, but it put them in a position where not having Steele very clearly is not significantly detracting from Gonzaga's season so far. But I don't know what would have happened if he was healthy. I know Mark Few mentioned at one point that they had originally discussed having Emmanuel Innocente redshirt, and the way that Mark Few phrased it was, but then once we got him in and we saw what he could do, we changed our mind on that. I think there is truth to that, but I also wonder if that timing lined up with, well, Steele's not going to play, so we shouldn't redshirt Innocente. We're already redshirting Smith, and we want to, make sure we have more depth. So I kind of get a sense that I don't think Steele would have played over Dusty, not the way Dusty has developed, not the way he has looked in the early going. So I kind of think Steele would be in that ninth role, which isn't much of a role. He'd be used differently than Innocente. Innocente comes in the first half to kind of give some added defensive oomph and to prevent guys on the backcourt from getting their third foul, whereas Venters would be used differently than that. He's not projected to be a very good defensive player, is more of a three-point shooter and floor spacer, offers things that Innocente hasn't quite offered yet, whereas Innocente brings more on the other end of the ball. So they wouldn't be used exactly the same way, but I think the minutes would be similar. And a lot of people thought I was wrong in saying that Steele wouldn't play much this year. And maybe I am. Maybe that wouldn't have been the situation, but it's hard to imagine him playing over any of the 8 who are currently in the rotation with the way those guys have looked at this point. And knowing that even if, Steele was healthy for this year, that they still probably would have babied him a little bit just because he was coming off such a significant injury. Folks, could Khalif Battle become the greatest Gonzaga transfer of all time? We're going to discuss that and a few other questions coming up here in just a second. But first, get ready to tackle the college hoops action this season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place those bets. Right now, the Zags odds have decreased. They're at plus 100 to win in Atlantis. They continue to go down as Arizona and other teams start to not look so great. Arizona's odds increased to plus 260. Indiana holds steady at plus 600. If you like those odds for the Zags, if you like some of the many other odds that they have on FanDuel, just visit FanDuel.com to join today. As a reminder, you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. Now, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. We're still going through Mailbag Monday here as we get ready for Feast Week and the exciting time for Gonzaga in the battle for Atlantis, a tournament they've never won, but are hoping to change that this year. This next question comes from Ted_ZEE117 on Discord, who says, do you think Khalif Battle has a chance to be the greatest transfer in Gonzaga history? I feel like other transfers were great complementary pieces, but Battle might be the best overall player on this team. The best single-year transfer in Gonzaga history? Maybe. The best overall transfer? No. I don't see a player, even if the best case scenario for Khalif Battle is that he is the best player on a team that wins the national championship. Let's be honest, that is the highest potential outcome that is realistic, and it is realistic that Khalif Battle is the best player, or at least the highest scorer. I think you could make an argument that if Gonzaga wins the national championship, it's because Ryan Nembhard plays as good as Ryan Nembhard can play, Graham Ike, et cetera, et cetera. And while I think there's a real possibility that Khalif Battle is Gonzaga's leading scorer this year, in fact, a decently high possibility, I don't know. You'd still have to debate whether he's the best player on the roster because of Ryan Nembhard's facilitation skills and some of the Graham Ike, if he plays big minutes, which again, we'll see if he's able to do that with foul issues. I think there'd be a debate on whether Khalif Battle would be the best player on the roster, but in the best case scenario, let's say he is definitively the best player and the team wins a championship. Is he the best single-year transfer ever? It'd be hard to argue against that. Brandon Clark was one of the best players in college basketball in his one season at Gonzaga. I would not call him a complimentary piece. That team was stacked, obviously, with talent, but I don't think that you could call what Clark brought on both ends of the floor. Again, I guess it depends on your definition of complimentary, but he wasn't the star in the sense of being the leading scorer. But again, there's more to it than that. Nigel Williams-Goss was, I think, the star player for Gonzaga on that championship run. And so I have a hard time seeing, again, if Khalif Battle led Gonzaga to a championship, as opposed to just making it, that's maybe the only way you could convince me that Battle deserves to be ahead of Williams-Goss and Clark. But I don't know that I could have him over Kyle Wiltshire, who spent multiple years at Gonzaga, averaged 20 points per game, which never, ever happens in college basketball, rarely happens at Gonzaga. I don't know if you could have him over even Andrew or Ryan Nembhard. I mean, again, if Gonzaga wins the championship and Battle's the leading scorer, unless Ryan Nembhard has a bad season, which he's already not doing, I have a hard time making the argument that Battle's a better transfer for Gonzaga than Ryan Nembhard if they both helped lead Gonzaga to a championship, and Ryan was also phenomenal last year. Same would be true of Graham in that case. And Andrew, to an extent as well, who was a huge part of a championship run for Gonzaga. So I think best single-year transfer possible. I'm not sure I'd say it's likely because I think Williams-Goss had such a profound impact on this team in that 1 year that he played on the fly. Obviously, he was at Gonzaga for 2 years, but only played 1 year, and Clark being in that conversation as well. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I don't know that I can see a reality where he is the greatest transfer period for Gonzaga over guys like Wiltshire and some of the others. Next question here comes from Jim on Facebook. Jim says, where does Nembhard rate so far as an all-time Zags point guard? He has a great question. He is like 1.2 seasons into his college basketball career, or his Gonzaga basketball career, I should say. So he's obviously got some time still to go. But last year, Nembhard set Gonzaga's single season assist record. He also set the record for assists per game in a season. If you consider passing and assists the most important skill for a point guard, which there is debate on that, and obviously different guards in Gonzaga's history have brought different skill sets to this team. Nobody's going to argue that Ryan Nembhard is the best defensive point guard the Zags have ever had, or even the best scoring point guard, three-point shooting point guard. He's none of those things. But if you're talking pure point guard, facilitation skills, taking care of the basketball, getting other players in positions to score, I mean, there's a very real possibility, very, very real. And in fact, I would call it likely possibility that Gonzaga, or that Nembhard finishes his 2-year Gonzaga career first and second place all time in assists in a single season, and first and second place all time in assists per game in a single season. Really hard to argue that he's not top 5, top 3 at that point. Again, not the 3-point shooter that Kevin Pangos was, or Dan Dickau for that, or scorer in general as either of those two guys. Certainly not the same scorer that Dickau was. Dickau averaged over 20 per game. Nembhard's not going to touch that. Certainly not the defensive player that Jalen Suggs was, or the downhill scorer, or the, just high-level superstar type player that Jalen Suggs was. But if Ryan leads Gonzaga to a Elite Eight, to a Final Four, certainly to a national championship, the conversation changes dramatically. I think there's a real possibility that I would be surprised if Ryan isn't considered a top 5 Gonzaga point guard when all is said and done. And I think there's a pretty good argument that he's there already. And that is not an easy group of point guards to be involved in when you consider Dickau and Pangos and Suggs and Stepp and Andrew Nembhard and Rivio and everybody Perkins. Like, it's Nigel Williams-Goss. It's an extraordinarily intense list of players. But I think that when all is said and done, Ryan will be a top 5 point guard in Gonzaga basketball history. He'll be considered the most prolific passing point guard in Gonzaga history in college. Obviously, hard to compare to John Stockton, who was the most prolific passing point guard in the history of basketball, at least according to his NBA stats. So, I think Ryan ends up top 5, maybe top 3. I think if he leads his team to a national championship and they win it, he's probably number 1. And I think it'd be hard to argue because he would have done something that not a single other point guard at Gonzaga has ever done. Next question comes from That Groovy Thing on Discord, who says, Gonzaga's defense is above average in all 4 factors, but field goal percentage is their best category. Opponents are shooting a crazy low 22.5% from 3 against the Zags. Do you expect this team to be exceptional at defending the 3 like this throughout the season, or is this a number you expect to come back down to earth? Yeah, I guess it depends on your definition of come back down to earth. I don't want to be pedantic here, but if the come back down to earth is referring to like going back to where Gonzaga has been historically, which is kind of below average at defending the 3-point line, no, I don't think they're going to fall back to that category. I think at the end of the season, Gonzaga is going to have ended up having a better defensive season in general than they have in the last couple of years, maybe even longer than that. And I think their ability to defend the perimeter will reflect better this season than it has recently. Is it going to be 22.5%? No, it is going to regress in a negative way going forward. 22.5% is obscenely low. This Gonzaga team is good defensively, better defensively than they've been. They are not that good defensively. I'm not sure there's a team in college basketball that is that good defensively to hold teams to 22.5%, especially when you consider that Gonzaga's played pretty good teams up to this point. Baylor, we'll see where they end up. By the time you're listening to this, you might know where they are in the top 25. I'm curious what exactly they're going to do with Baylor, who gets a crazy win over St. John's, but gets waxed by Tennessee. It'll be interesting to see where they show up. But they're a good team. Arizona State is looking like a decent team. San Diego State's going to be a decent team. And those teams all shot pretty poorly against Gonzaga. I think some of that is just some early season wonkiness, and we're going to see some teams get super hot against Gonzaga and shoot it really well. But ultimately, I think at the end of the year, this Gonzaga team will be a better defensive team than we've seen from Mark Few's clubs in the last half decade or so. Final question of the segment comes from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, what do you think are the chances that the Gonzaga men and women's team go a combined 6-0 during Feast Week games? If not 6-0, what do you think the combined record of the two teams will be in Feast Week? Well, I already gave my prediction on the men's side. Gonzaga, of course, in the battle for Atlantis. I believe they will play West Virginia. I believe they will play Indiana. I believe they will play Arizona. In the championship, I believe they will win all 3 games. That would put the men's team at 3-0. Obviously, they could play Louisville. They could also end up playing, if Arizona does not win, it's possible they could play Providence, Oklahoma, or Davidson. But I think the likely scenario is Gonzaga gets 3 wins over West Virginia, Indiana, and Arizona. The women are in the Paradise Jam in the Virgin Islands. They will play Missouri State, Texas Tech, and Florida State. Those are the 3 games for them. They're already predetermined who they will be playing in those 3 games. I have the women going 2-1. My expectation is they will beat Missouri State. They will lose to Florida State. And that Texas Tech game feels kind of like a toss-up. Texas Tech beat Washington State earlier this year by, I think, 4. They beat Rice earlier this year, but not by much. Gonzaga beat Rice recently. Gonzaga is expected to be the top team in the WCC ahead of Washington State. But I think Gonzaga is probably a little bit better. They were better against Rice than Texas Tech was, although it's basically about the same, I think. And they're, I think, probably more than 4 points better than Wazoo. But again, that game feels like a toss-up. Texas Tech's a good team. They're not a great team, but they're a good team. Florida State's a very good team. I think for Gonzaga, if they beat Missouri State and they beat Texas Tech, their 3rd game will be against Florida State and playing the best team after playing 2 straight games, after traveling across the country with a team that does not have a lot of depth. As I'm recording this, it's shortly after Gonzaga just polished off New Mexico on the road, which is a very nice win for Lisa Fortier's team. And Esther Little was back after not playing earlier in the week against Rice. That's fantastic, but we still haven't seen Taylor Dalton. We still haven't seen Lauren Whitaker. We still haven't seen some of the players who've been out with injuries this year. So I think if they're not at full strength, if those players are not back, which I don't have any indication that they will be at this point, then I don't think that we're going to see Gonzaga be able to pull off 3 straight wins. And the fact that they're playing the toughest team last makes me think that that Florida State game is going to be very hard to win. 5-1 between the men's and women's teams would be a pretty phenomenal result for these 2 clubs. So I wouldn't be feeling too bad about it if that's what ends up happening for both these programs. Well, Gonzaga has 3 centers on the roster who are all left-handed. Is it a coincidence? It's not exactly a new thing for this program to have lefties down on the block. So we're going to talk about it coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, going to live events, it's the absolute best. Whether it's concerts, whether it's musical theater shows, whether it's a comedy show. And finally, of course, college sports are back. I'm looking forward to making a ton of new memories this college hoops season. And the best news is when you're getting tickets for this year, Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste your time searching through thousands of tickets. And right now, tickets for Gonzaga versus Kentucky, Climate Pledge Arena, Battle in Seattle, they remain on sale. You can still get 2 tickets in the upper deck for $63 a piece. So folks, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. And we're closing out the show with 3 more mailbag questions to start out the week. Then we're, of course, going to get you even more ready for the battle for Atlantis, more ready for that first game against West Virginia, all coming up on future episodes of Locked On Zags. For now, closing out mailbag, this question comes from Jim on Facebook, who says, notice that Diani is a lefty. All our current 5s are. Many from the past are as well. Shem, Sabonis, Sam. Almost feels intentional. What say you? Yeah, it's funny. This is funny timing on this question because I actually saw a clip from the Perimeter podcast with Adam Morrison. If you haven't checked it out, good stuff, of course. Always fun to hear Ammo talk Gonzaga basketball. And he was asked about Braden Huff and like what he likes about Braden's game. And one of the first things Morrison mentioned was he likes that he's left-handed. And he said the same thing that we hear a lot about lefties. I say I hear it a lot because I was a left-handed post player, so maybe that's where that comes from. But they're tougher to defend is kind of the general mantra. And from my understanding, the main reason that people think that is just because like this, especially in like younger levels, you don't know that the guy's left-handed. You're expecting them to be right-handed. The amount of times where I would get guarded, where they would kind of shield me to go to my left, and I would just be able to do that because that's the hand that was dominant. But in the era of, college basketball in general, where you have scouting and you have video and you have, these sessions where you're watching these players, that's not going to be as much of an advantage. So I think it's more so just like, you're not as familiar with defending them. Like you're not as used to defending guys, but most post players in college should be able to go either way. So as a defender, you should be able to capably defend a guy going to his right or to his left. So I'm not sure how much of the surprise factor or the like this is unique factor. I actually don't know how much of a difference it makes. I would be curious if that is something that could be studied. It would take, I mean, you'd have to just watch thousands and thousands of hours of tape and extrapolate that data. And I don't know if anybody's got the time. Maybe we'll ping like Evan Miyakawa or somebody like that to see if they can pull some of that data, because I am curious about it. And it makes me wonder whether there is some legitimacy to that data or not. It does make me wonder if Gonzaga pays any extra attention to this. I have to imagine that it is mostly a coincidence, but I mean, it's a long list. Again, just in the question alone, we're talking about Shema Karnowski, Domantas Sabonis, Sam Dower, and then all three of Gonzaga's current bigs, Graham Ike, Braden Huff, and Ismaila Diane. Jonathan Williams was not mentioned in here. He's another left-handed big for Gonzaga as well. I am sure there are others. I am sure I am missing some. Feel free to drop a comment. Let me know if there's a lefty big that we're missing from this conversation, but that's a lot as it is. I mean, most of those guys were all starters. The only ones who haven't been starters at this point are Huff and Diane, who are both potentially future starters for this team. And obviously Sabonis was a superstar. Shem was one of the best of all time. Graham's been great. So like, I do wonder if Gonzaga maybe more highly values left-handed bigs, and so that's maybe why there have been a few more of them who've ended up there. Some of them were guys who weren't super highly recruited, like, you know, Sam is probably the best example in that area. Braden Huff, maybe the next best example of somewhat under recruited bigs. Some of them are just Euro bigs, which we know that the Zags have heavily pursued in the past. So I don't know if it's more than just a coincidence, but it's a large enough number that there's maybe something there. Final two questions of the show both come from Jeff. Jeff says, what do you like most about Feast Week? And with college basketball games literally going from 9 a.m. until midnight Pacific time, Monday through Saturday, how many games with your young family going to let you get away with watching this week? Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to have my iPad up a lot. Going to have the little iPad up while I'm watching the baby, while we're making dinner, whatever it may be. That thing's going to be following me around and getting charged every couple of hours. That's the best way that I'm going to be able to watch a lot of these games. We're not traveling we're going to a family that's local, so we're not going to be in the car for a long time. So yeah, I'm going to get a chance to watch a good amount of basketball this week, and I'm really looking forward to it. There's some phenomenal games. We'll talk about them to close out the show that are non-Zag related. But my favorite part about Feast Week, if we're sticking with it from the college basketball perspective, which I will, this is kind of when you start to see certain programs really separate themselves. You know, I think early in the year, a lot of teams load up their schedule with cupcakes. Gonzaga has been guilty of this. I say guilty as if it's a bad thing. It's not really a bad thing. Like, we're poking fun of UConn having one of the worst strengths of schedules in all of college basketball going up into Maui, but then they go into Maui and they're going to play UConn or Memphis, and they're going to play either Auburn or Iowa State. Like, they're going to play some good teams. And that's what I think I like about it, is you finally start to get to see some of these teams who haven't really challenged themselves yet start to face those challenges. Gonzaga has been in that category in the past. They're not this year. They have already been challenged. As noted previously, West Virginia will be their third Big 12 opponent of the season already. So they're not in that category, but many other teams are. It'll be our first real good look at, you know, what does this UConn team look like? You know, other teams like, Iowa State hasn't really challenged themselves up to this point, and they're going to play Auburn in the first round of this tournament, if Maui. So that, I think, is a big part of it. And then I just think I like the tournament style. I like the history, the tradition of events like Maui and Atlantis. Like, I'm very sad to not see Big Bill Walton in Maui this year. That's going to be tough to not have him there, but seeing all the Hawaiian shirts and just kind of the general tradition that you get from those events, specifically Maui and Atlantis, because a lot of the other ones have undergone a fair amount of changes. And then I think I like that it's one of the few times of the year where college basketball really kind of dominates the headlines. Obviously, Thanksgiving specifically is dominated by football. It always will be, as long as the Cowboys and Lions are always playing on Thanksgiving. But for the most part, this week really kind of belongs to college basketball. And outside of March, where obviously that's, you know, the huge, it's kind of the only time that it really does. So I think the combination of history, tradition, getting to see some good teams play other good teams, and kind of having it be the story of the sports season is kind of the main things I like about Feast Week. Final question of the show leads into it nicely. Another one from Jeff. He says, in addition to the games Gonzaga will play this week, what 5 or 6 games would you recommend that we watch during Feast Week? Yeah, lots of fantastic games this week. I'll recommend a few that are just either top tier teams playing each other, which is always fun, or maybe even a few that have a Gonzaga affiliation to them. Starts with the first game that's going on in the Maui Invitational on Monday at 11:30 a.m. These are all Pacific time. Memphis taking on UConn. UConn's first big test of the season. Memphis, a team that just beat San Francisco, that has looked pretty good this year under Penny Hardaway, despite a lot of turmoil. Very excited to see how the Huskies look in that one. Speaking of San Francisco, the next game is them taking on Clemson as part of the Sunshine Slam. That game is also on Monday at 3:30 Pacific time. San Francisco beat Boise State, who beat Clemson. So it'll be interesting to see if San Francisco can kind of prove that those results are valid and beat this Clemson team out of the ACC. Tuesday, 6 p.m. Pacific time, Kansas at Duke. Doesn't get a whole lot better than that. Two legit blue bloods taking each other on. That's a standalone game, not part of any of the MTEs, but a feast week. Phenomenal game for us to take in. And then as part of the Players Era NIL Festival, Tuesday, 5 p.m. Pacific time, Houston at Alabama, one of the best defensive teams in the world. And Kelvin Sampson's Cougs taking on a really good offensive team for NATO. It's in Alabama. That should be a really fun one. Thursday, Thanksgiving, 1 p.m. Pacific time, Arkansas at Illinois, a family affair. Zvonimir Ivisic, Big Z, the sophomore who followed Calipari from Kentucky to Arkansas. His brother, Timoslav Ivisic, plays for Illinois. It'll be fun to see those two guys go at each other. Also, two fun and talented teams going at each other on Thanksgiving. And then last, another Thanksgiving game as well. Obviously, the Zags will be playing on Thanksgiving. We don't know what time yet, but Thursday evening, after you guys have all had your tryptophan and your turkey, if you want to fall asleep on the couch to something, let's have it be USC taking on St. Mary's. Will be fun to see how the Gales look against another Power 5 opponent, and it'll be fun to see how that USC team that Gonzaga struggled with in the exhibition season looks against a quality opponent in St. Mary's. All right, that's going to wrap it up for me today here in the Locked On Zags podcast. I want to thank all of you for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Give a special shout out to those everyday listeners and those of you hanging out on the Locked On Zags Discord channel. Like I said, we'll get more into the battle for Atlantis as well as the individual matchup against West Virginia coming up in the next couple of days. We're also keeping our eye on the Jalen Warley situation, the Virginia transfer, see if he ends up committing to Spokane in the next couple of days as well. Thanks again for listening, folks. And until next time, as always, go Zags.